emissions. Wolfgang, thank you so much for being here, and take it away.
Thank you, Josh. And my God, just looking at your names, impressive and daunting. I admire and follow the work of so many of you. And this is also why when Josh, thanks to the introduction via Catherine, invited me last year, I very spontaneously and without much thought said no, thank you, because the topic is impossible to comprehend. A lot has happened since then. The climate crisis itself has accelerated, as you all know. And through my work with news organizations, as well as with some of the world's largest NGOs or the United Nations, I did come to the conclusion that we can't possibly afford to not engage with the question of what role faith-based communities and religions play in climate change, and especially in climate education. We are only 3 weeks away from the next COP Climate Summit in Dubai. I'm on the last stretch of preparing. I sleep very little currently, which is why I decided to bring a script with me. I will try to speak freely as much as possible, but please forgive me if I have to read a passage or two. It is one thing to speak about climate journalism or my work with some of the world's largest corporations on their climate strategies, where you have metrics and numbers and jurisdictions. It's quite something else, as you know from the last 2 days, also to speak about something as unquantifiable as religions. Also in the context that even the so-called world religions are not monoliths, are typically not centrally run, are highly diverse in their interpretation by region and by the socio-demographics of their practitioners. It is then also very tempting to speak of at least the indigenous belief systems as one block, as the non-institutionalized belief systems or the others. But at closer look, you will know some of them have lineages and histories that are far older than any of our so-called world religions. It should give us pause, though, speaking of indigenous religions, that currently 80% of the remaining biodiversity on this planet is located on lands of indigenous peoples. My talk, as you can already tell, will be as fragmentary as the current spiritual landscape, but I will speak from the hopefully coherent perspective of someone who is an advisor on climate issues and on climate narratives, and who sees, whether it is in boardrooms or newsrooms or at NGOs or the private homes of families, that we are at risk of underestimating the spiritual dimension of the current climate debate and also the spiritual anguish climate change and the awareness of climate change can trigger. And to get the terminology question out of the way from the start, given you're all writers, of course, climate change is a misleading frame. But none of the other terms don't quite capture either the enormity of what we are facing. So the favorite escape route of any journalist and his lexical variants, I will resort to the climate challenge, the climate crisis, the climate situation, the climate emergency, and my favorite, borrowed from the social question of the early industrial age, is the climate question. Because nothing short of birth or death confronts us as profoundly as these current changes in our Earth systems do that no generation before us had to witness. Not even the humans who lived through the last glacial periods, as their changes of their climate happened so much more slowly than anything we're experiencing today. And as an added spiritual dimension, no generation before us had to come to terms with the fact of it being us humans who have caused these changes and have inflicted them not only on ourselves, but also on every other living being on this planet. Beings to the largest part who have been here long before us without unhinging entire Earth systems. I will spare you, though, with the seemingly mandatory opening of any talk currently, book, film, or essay about climate change. And so I will not present you with a list of the most recent extreme weather events, nor will I mention what a remaining carbon budget is, because you all know. You are journalists. To me, this routine, including in journalism, of still saying in different versions, listen everyone, climate change is real, it's now, it's happening, it's here, it's getting worse. To me, Doing this even when an audience, or the vast majority of an audience, is completely aware of those facts, does itself increasingly constitute a subtle form of denial. Even in the US, the percentage of so-called climate science deniers, or the dismissives in the terminology of the long-running Yale study called the Six Americas, even in the US, the percentage of the outright dismissives who say climate change is a hoax hovers at 11% since 2012. It's not growing. It is being overprojected by certain media, but it is not growing. So by still insisting on saying it's real, it's here, did you know, as if you didn't, the question is, what other conversations are we avoiding by endlessly repeating the basics? By me pretending that I still had to update you on global warming being real, I'm taking you back to a time when that was still news, instead of me taking you forward and myself to facing much more profound questions. Some examples. At the personal level, what does it mean now to be human and to live a meaningful life now that the life journey we may once have envisioned as children, and that we certainly envision for our children if we have some, now that they are at least questionable, if not obsolete? What does a meaningful career mean then? Or at the spiritual level, what is our place in nature now that the concept of us living in the Anthropocene is no longer just a concept to ponder, but something we can experience pretty much on every walk through your inner city park? You will notice, if you allow yourself to notice, that there are not as many songbirds anymore as there have been 10 years ago. In Europe, the total number of butterflies has declined by 1/3 within 10 years. It takes work to not notice that. What is our place in nature then? What is our place on this planet, and what is our place in history? These are all deeply spiritual questions with real-world ramifications. And then at the societal level, the collective level, if we talk about increasing, for instance, the physical climate resilience of our shorelines or of our inner cities, what do climate resilient democracies or faith systems look like then? Democracies or faith-based communities that can withstand the shocks of increasing climate-related disasters and that can muster the compassion and the means to host those that had to leave entire regions of the world that probably within our lifetimes will no longer be inhabitable, at least not for the entire year. So this is why this current emphasis on this week's or last week's extreme weather events with that underlying theme of climate change is here. Can you see it? Potentially distorts even journalism, as long as it doesn't give equal attention to these much deeper questions, of which many are very spiritual. This is not to say that climate change, and I'm sure many of you practice at least occasional climate journalism, this is not to say that climate journalism hasn't improved tremendously just within these last 2 years. I'm very happy, for instance, to see how many news organizations have managed to move the climate story beyond the science or the climate desk, and to have climate change being referenced in sports journalism, food, real estate, health, lifestyle, or any other desk. This is progress in the sense that climate change has been normalized as something that is systemic and affects every topic. But with that, the denial has somewhat moved upstream. And I will come full circle to religion and faith as a dimension of that in a minute. Instead of initially denying the existence of global warming and then the fact of human-made climate change, we currently seem to be in a phase of wanting to normalize both of these, but as some sort of stable background, as a static wallpaper that informs wine journalism or alpine sports journalism, while the very nature and core challenge of our age is that we have just entered an era that is characterized exactly by there not being a new normal anymore as far as our climate is concerned. And this is why even the extreme weather events of today, as heartbreaking as they are, paradoxically, are not the most profound piece of news anymore. The news is, for instance, that we collectively struggle with comprehending that there won't be a new normal. More recent science says, which is good news, that we could at least stop further global warming once we brought down our emissions to zero, which wasn't a certainty up until recently. But there is no plausible pathway yet how we could then get global average temperatures back down to, let's say, 1 degree above pre-industrial times and that relative climate stability that would give us. So we are the very first people who have left behind what was normal for the last roughly 11,000 years, when humans began to settle down and started farming in the same location year after year, and then eventually built cities exactly because the climate had stabilized. The news is we don't comprehend what has already happened to the stability that we will not get back. The news is also we don't comprehend how little time we have left now to remain at least under 2 degrees Celsius. The related news is that we largely do not comprehend how the impact of a warming by 1.5 degrees doesn't just get worse in a linear fashion if we warm by 1.6. The news for which to comprehend we may also need new spiritual frameworks. The news is that collectively, including myself, we are confronted with something that we may understand intellectually, but do not understand, do not comprehend. And of course, that can be said about many other scientific phenomena and wonders that we don't understand, except for this one is different in that we have to understand it within the next few years to not carry the risk of further derailing life on this planet in its entirety. And this, I think, is where the role of religions in various faith-based communities becomes extremely interesting and useful and potentially helpful. What can the ability or the tendency of religions to reach into the unknown, into the incomprehensible, what can that teach us in our now extremely urgent need to mobilize ourselves collectively into adequate climate action? And to have this discussion this week is very timely. You may know this. In less than a month, more than 190 national governments and about 70,000 climate professionals of all sorts, more than ever before, are gathering in Dubai for COP28. And for the first time in the history of these now 28 climate summits, there will be interfaith forums and interfaith programming hosted by the UN and the Muslim Council of Elders. And with intensive programming, not just for one day, but throughout the entire summit, which, as you can imagine now in the context of the war in Israel, leads to all kinds of unexpected complications, but will very much change the tone of the summit. And also, this is not the first time for interfaith organizations to engage with the COP. Most people don't know that there was a very important Hindu declaration on climate change in 2009, already asking for phasing out fossil fuels. There is a document of Buddhist leaders called the Buddhist Response to the Climate Emergency from 2008, asking for the same. Before the most important COP summit in Paris 2015, the UN endorsed already an Islamic declaration on climate change. And then, of course, there's the encyclical Laudato Si of Pope Francis, also from 2015. What is new is the sheer variety and the understanding of many spiritual leaders that if they do not prove the relevance of their faith in addressing climate change, that they themselves may face a crisis of legitimacy of a new dimension. But let's take a step back from the flurry of faith-based activities and the climate summit. Why is there excitement about faith-based communities getting more engaged in climate negotiations? And before trying to answer those two questions, I'd like to tell you a personal story because I can't come up with a better example and may have to make myself a bit more vulnerable than I'm used to. When I was done with my contribution to the merger of these two Condé Nast companies 3 years ago and could finally step aside and do research on climate change in Oxford at Templeton College, I thought all I had to do now was to read as much as I can, to study, to share notes and papers, to publish, to meet world-leading experts, to then finally find a spot in that systemic change where I could add value and hopefully make a contribution. I did not think or even anticipate that I also had to work on the limits of my own imagination, let alone that I would meet my own fears or sense of loss I wasn't even aware of. And this may sound callous to you or blokish or superficial, but I didn't think I would ever get deeply scared or emotionally desperate while doing research on climate questions. And don't worry, this is not going to turn into the story of my religious or spiritual awakening. It isn't. But what I'm trying to illustrate is what can happen if we underestimate the profound effects of the climate crisis on our psyche and the accompanying deep spiritual questions that can trigger. So why did I not expect to be shaken by what I was about to study? It's my past also as a journalist. When I was 20 as a conscientious objector in Germany, I had to do civil service as an auxiliary nurse in a psychiatric hospital for almost 2 years. And there already I saw the depths of human anguish, old men who were former child soldiers in World War II, and then in old age suddenly had no longer the ability to suppress what they had seen, what had been done to them, or what they had been doing to others. And me, being barely adult, I found myself surrounded by men who turned into scared children again. I also experienced the loss of several patients I had learned to know very well across all ages to suicide. But I managed to cope with that. I don't think it traumatized me. Later, I was a news anchor, a news editor, a reporter for many years, and I didn't quite think that I had seen it all, but I certainly thought that I was in possession of the necessary professional routines and reflexes to deal with pretty much any distressing information I could run into. And already in my early 20s, I worked for Germany's national broadcaster, ARD, and I remember one night, in hindsight rather careless senior producer asked me to monitor the incoming 24/7 news feed that came in through the European Broadcasting Union's network of correspondents. And one night, I was sitting in one of those windowless underground production studios on my own, was monitoring that feed. And I do remember seeing footage from one of the war reporters that was untouched yet. And I wish I hadn't seen those images. To this day, they are tattooed into my memory. And yet, I don't think they traumatized me. So this is why I was so surprised by what happened then during my time in Oxford. I was reading, as I mentioned, voraciously, and there was a time for unrelated reasons. I thought I want to get another Apple Watch, another smartwatch that can read my pulse. But I hadn't used my last one that was outdated, so I did the responsible thing. I pulled it out of a drawer, put it on just to see whether I would wear it. And I saw that my heart rate every time when I was reading about climate change was at really dangerous levels. I come from a family of doctors and nurses, and they were very alarmed by what I was telling them. I didn't know. I had only noticed while reading already in the days prior, and maybe subconsciously, this is why I wanted that watch, I had noticed that I felt hyper alert and bright awake and super intelligent, but barely able to hold a thought while reading. I did not know that I had already, after months of studying climate change in various aspects, that I had effectively become ill and was at risk of getting severely ill. So of course I did what you do. I took breaks, I started sports, I made sure I speak about what I'm seeing versus thinking I could process it on my own, and I'm well. But whenever someone asks me now, especially journalists with the same attitude as I had, what should I read? I would like to get up to speed on this climate thing. The first thing I say is don't read on your own. Don't do this alone. Start a reading group. Who are you reading with? If you're serious about studying this, there will come a point when you don't want to be alone. So this experience made me very curious about that narrow but very deep canyon between knowing something and truly comprehending something. What does it take to get from knowing to comprehending? What is the price we pay for comprehending, and what or who can help us in making this process of moving from knowing to comprehending this climate crisis less painful and possibly even rewarding, but certainly faster, because we're running out of time. I also became curious about that multi-layered nature of denial and the evolutionary function of denial, and how denial is an integral part of our human psyche as a means of self-protection. If we were always aware of all the things that could happen or are likely to happen, we wouldn't function. And then again, do spirituality or religions have any place in that set of possible answers to that question? Because In journalism, we are facing a lot of denial. And many times our only answer to it is more content, not changing the frame, the ways of presenting or engaging with an audience. And as you know, a common journalistic theory of change is that journalism's greatest strength is to provide well-sourced facts and figures, which then over time lead to a change in values and perceptions, which then again lead to positive behavioral change or help fortify existing positive behaviors, such as democratic behaviors. Neuroscientists have long disproven this presumed causal chain and can show that we often change our behaviors long before we change our values. They have also shown that it isn't primarily factual evidence, in the sense of facts and figures that we journalists like so much, that make us change behaviors, but rather the observation of seeing others, especially others whom we trust, change their behaviors, which is something that is much closer to our psychological heritage as effectively herd animals. I also thought that denial could be overcome in one breakthrough moment. In fact, that denial needed to be broken, to be faced head-on, and that there would be a point after which the door would be closed firmly behind you. Of course, we know denial is multi-layered, and in many ways it never ends. I wouldn't claim of myself of having overcome my denial of what the climate crisis means. There's a minute here or there in my day where I feel I'm halfway present with it. Most of the day, I'm not. And I'm not even sure I want to. So I suspect this is also the underlying assumption of a journalistic theory of change that still manifests itself very often in climate journalism, that is very alarming, laden with peer-reviewed facts and figures, striking photos, and soaked in the belief, if you only tell it as it is as often as possible, in all its scary and sometimes doomist detail, that somehow good things will come from it, and that people who had been passive until then would get jolted into getting active, or at least curious. Having seen as an executive and as a digital strategist the digital audience data of this type of journalism in my different management roles at The Guardian, Condé Nast, Die Zeit, many titles, all continents, I keep wondering why news organizations are still doing this, and I started looking for alternative approaches during my research in Oxford. And some of the first editors I interviewed back then in my research were the editors of news publications for children. Because I had seen children's publications frequently cover IPCC reports or extreme weather events, publications such as National Geographic for Kids, Le Petit Quotidien in France, or the UK's very successful Le Week Junior. I thought if anyone would think or have a reason to think about how to convey the climate risks we're facing without demoralizing or disempowering their audience, it had to be the editors of these children's publications, which mostly turned out to be true. The editors of The Week Junior told me that they would always make sure to accompany fear-inducing news reports about climate issues with even unrelated stories placed right next to it in a print publication about children who do things, who run a campaign, who work on a piece of technology or software, who raise money, anything to convey you have agency in this. You are not only exposed to this as a passive recipient. The climate scientist Michael Mann, one of the world's most influential climate scientists at the University of Pennsylvania, calls this the necessary twin approach of never just conveying the urgency, but always also to convey how an audience has agency. He says urgency without agency just leads us toward despair and defeatism. And this, again, is the question of where every one of us, our audiences, our clients, our counterparts in policy and regulation, and us ourselves can find that sense of agency, of self-efficacy, of plausible hope. And I think this is also where different faith-based religions, as much as indigenous spiritualities, can play a very important role. Throughout my career in journalism and media management across all inhabited continents, there were just a few, not many, but a few constants. One is that whenever we asked audiences which issues, which topics we should cover more often, health and the environment always came first. Whether that was Germany's Die Zeit, The Guardian, Wired magazine, The New Yorker, vogue across Asia, Middle East, Africa, Europe, or the Americas. Always health and the environment. When we then asked audiences how we could improve specifically our climate coverage, many times our audiences asked for more information specifically about what they could do themselves. What can I do? And I didn't recognize that for what it is, and I really regret that because I often felt conflicted by this request, because it's also a known phenomenon, as you know, that certain oil majors especially have a strategic interest in people overestimating what is called their personal carbon footprint and having less interest in the activities and the footprint of the heavy emitters. So by us putting too much emphasis on what our readers could do as individuals, we were worried we would inadvertently play into that frame of the personal carbon footprint and not cover the issue adequately. But what we did not sufficiently appreciate is how important that question of what can I do is as a means of having agency, and that sense of agency really is a prerequisite for someone even being willing to engage with your journalism about the urgency. So what gives agency then? I think it can be practical information, of course, things you can do as a consumer, as a voter, as an entrepreneur, as a researcher, as an activist, but also spiritual information. As an example, there are people who I spoke with who feel a very strong sense of guilt or shame towards nature for the destruction we have caused collectively. And for some of them, that sense of guilt can be so strong that they rather continue to not care about nature or climate change at all, rather than to confront their sense of shame. It's very human, very understandable. And spiritual concepts such as forgiveness, self-forgiveness, or also intergenerational forgiveness can help at least some of these people. I spoke with the wonderful Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg in London about this topic a few weeks ago, and he's deeply involved in what is called eco-Judaism. He said, it is our beliefs that often make us do things of which we ourselves won't see the harvest during our lifetime. Again, that different sense of time that comes with certain faiths. Agency. He also said, our beliefs do not only make us do things, our beliefs also enable and motivate us to stop doing certain things, even though we could continue doing them. To stop certain climate-damaging behaviors we could just as well continue with. So it is this notion of this interplay between urgency, agency, and faith I wanted to establish today, before now also looking at some of the more conventional ways in which faith-based organizations, and especially due to their size and financial power, the Christian churches, and also their regional footprint, can make truly enormous contributions in tackling global warming. Because as you know, in addition to their spiritual role, churches are vast landowners, operators of large forestries and agricultural operations, of buildings, of church buildings that need heating and cooling. They're asset owners, investors across a wide range of industries. They are parent organizations of hospitals, welfare organizations, refugee and development organizations. They can be owners of media assets, TV stations, radio stations, book publishing companies. Religious organizations own universities, schools, kindergartens. They can be a country's largest employer. In Germany, the Catholic Church's Caritas institutions are the country's largest employer with 700,000 employees ahead of the government itself. Germany's Protestant Church is the country's 6th largest employer, right after VW. So just from the perspective of their own greenhouse gas emissions, as well as, especially as landowners, from their capacity to capture and sequester emissions through their land base, or through their ability to influence entire global supply chains through their enormous purchasing power, churches are major carbon players, which is also why some of them will have to measure their religious statements on climate change very, very carefully, and why the Pope's most recent positions are even more remarkable. So how could we bring some structure to even reviewing a church's role in climate change? You may know this, but when a city or a large corporation measures and then categorizes and reports their greenhouse gas emissions, they use a framework called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. The framework is very simple. It has 3 main buckets or scopes, scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1 are all the emissions that an entity causes directly in their factory, or if you run a farm, the emissions directly from your animals, that's your Scope 1. Scope 2 are the emissions from all the energy you purchase, where you already increasingly have a choice, whether you buy renewable or not. And then Scope 3 is typically where 80 to 90% of your emissions sit. Those are the emissions from every service and every good you purchase, your entire supply chain, and then downstream, the lifetime emissions from everything you sell, services or goods. Now, of course, you could say, what about banks? How do you measure their role, given they have such an important role? Banks have developed a framework for measuring what is called financed emissions. So if you as a bank finance a coal mine or a coal power plant, the emissions during the lifetime of that, let's say, 10-year loan are on you as your financed emissions as a bank. Insurance companies are developing frameworks for insured emissions. The world's major law firms are in conversations about advised emissions when they help with a major of big oil, for instance. Consultancies are expected to soon start working on what would then be consulted emissions. So it's not quite the same as the spiritual services that churches provide, but there certainly are frameworks for highly intangible goods and services that are being provided by other organizations that are now being captured and measured. So you see where I'm going with this. Almost everything that faith-based institutions touch or do in the physical world can be categorized and then grouped together. And I think it is actually important to do this because current discussions about the role of faith-based institutions and churches in climate change constantly jump back and forth between these different dimensions. You can have a theological conversation and then someone says, but look, the wonderful thing they did with their forestry, as if one could offset the other. These really need to be looked at in abstract and in separation, for which there are frameworks. Now, in closing, I would advise against trying to compare religions for their potential in addressing climate change. I would find it worthwhile, though, to spend more time on understanding what that most fundamental, most architectural, spiritual challenge it is that the climate crisis presents us all with collectively, and that we need to address as we're trying to stabilize Earth's climate again within only a few years. To me personally, I think there is something in humanity's self-perception as us being this old, established species that stands in our way now. I think if we were more able to see ourselves as a comparatively very young species that is only in its early teenage years, I think it would make it easier for us to admit that we have made a grave mistake collectively in burning up Earth's carbon sinks that now needs correction. We don't only need scientific or technological know-how to face the climate crisis. We will also need the spiritual competence to admit a profound mistake and then to somehow forgive ourselves while addressing this mistake forcefully. So it stands in our way like a roadblock to still think of ourselves as this crown of creation, and it would probably help us if we saw ourselves rather as mostly well-intentioned, highly gifted kids who, compared to most other species here, have just arrived and who are just beginning to learn how to even live here without breaking too much. We can stabilize our climate again. We can do this. But doing so under this enormous time pressure will require more from us than just technology, smart regulation, and climate finance. It will require from us that we at least begin to redefine our place on this wonderful and challenging planet. And that in itself is a spiritual endeavor.